right, so talking here about privilege arbitrage, the idea is how to make your culture more inclusive. You can see here on the slides, my name, Kojo, and my Twitter handle is @transition. And so if you have any questions or comments about this talk or just about random stuff in general, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. That's probably the best way. All right, so first I'm going to give a sort of a brief sort of gentle reminder about soft talks. So I have spoken at a few different conferences. I have also helped organize DjangoCon 2016, DjangoCon US 2016, and one of the things that comes up from time to time is that there are some people who feel unhappy about, quote unquote, too many soft talks or community talks or non-technical talks. And I thought it would be useful to remind people, and I think the people here in the Portland community don't have this issue, but you might run into it from time to time with people who have that concern. I thought it would be useful to remind people that with all of the cool technical stuff we use in the Python community and in the Django community and all that sort of thing, all those things are done by volunteers. So Python, the core language itself, Django, a lot of the other frameworks, but also all the meetups. So from your local Python meetup to regional ones like PyDX or PyTexas, where I'm from, up to PyCon and DjangoCon, those things are all produced by volunteers. Those volunteers come from our community. And so all the community talks that you hear, ones like mine that talk about inclusion and diversity, or other talks that you might see people do about mental illness or avoiding burnout and that sort of thing, all those talks are designed to strengthen the members of the community and thus strengthen those volunteers who provide all these things, like these wonderful conferences that we like to come to, and also the actual Python language itself. So just something to consider if you hear people complain about too many soft talks and things not being technical enough. Without the volunteers, all the cool technical stuff goes away. So that leads into my talk. When I joined the Python community more actively in 2013, one of my thoughts was, how can I actually make a contribution? So I am relatively new to software development. I spent most of my career as an accountant, and I knew I was an awesome programmer. So how do I make a contribution? My approach was to try to look at making the community larger and also making the number of contributors within the community larger. And so that led me to give a number of talks on things like diversity and inclusion, because that helps you draw in more people who will actually be willing to contribute to your community. As a result of giving talks like that, one of the responses or comments that I keep hearing from people as well, Kojo, like, how do I help? I understand that you've talked about inclusion and that's useful and it has benefits, but what can I do to help that? So this talk focuses on that. How can you actually try to help make things a little more inclusive? So it's well documented that diverse teams lead to better solutions. I'm going to let you Google it. Say a specific string like diverse teams improve solutions. There's a lot of documentation there about that. Now, an inclusive culture is what leads to more diverse teams. And there's a lot of talk about diversity, but inclusion is what makes diversity stable. You can go out and grab people and draw them in, but are they going to want to stay in your community? Are they going to want to contribute? Excuse me. And that's not going to happen unless you actually have an inclusive culture. So an inclusive culture is going to lead you to these diverse teams. It's a more sustainable form of diversity. That's what a lot of my talks in the past have been about. So the question then is, okay, well, Kojo, that's fantastic, but how do I get to a more inclusive culture? And my solution, or one of the solutions I'm proposing, is what I call privilege arbitrage. And privilege arbitrage requires a few things to actually make it work. One of those is increased privilege awareness. And so even if you know the term privilege or you're familiar with the idea, a deeper understanding of how privilege actually functions and where it comes from is useful for you to actually perform privilege arbitrage, which is a set of actions that you can actually take. So when you look here, we see that privilege awareness has this sort of squiggly line leading to inclusive culture. So privilege awareness is a necessary condition for privilege arbitrage, but it's not sufficient. You need this awareness, but you still have to actually take action based on this awareness. So it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. At the same time, privilege awareness is a necessary but not sufficient condition for privilege arbitrage. So here we've got an inclusive culture, here we've got privilege arbitrage. So again, you need slightly enhanced privilege awareness before you can perform privilege arbitrage, but just the awareness in and of itself isn't sufficient. So I think a lot of people here in the room, or just in tech communities in general, might have heard of the term privilege. You might be familiar with that. But what is arbitrage? Some people may be familiar with it, some may not be. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Arbitrage is a financial term. And so again, my career before software development was in accounting, and so it's familiar to me. Arbitrage is a financial term. It basically looks at systemic differences in price that can lead to a profit. So a simple example is, if you can buy, say, Japanese yen at a price of 99 cents here in, say, in one market, and then you can sell them, there's another market where you can sell them for $1, you've got instantaneous risk-free profit. Because you can buy a thing here for 99 cents, sell it there for $1. And that's financial arbitrage. So here, and again, it's based on just systemic differences in those markets. In this case, with privilege arbitrage, the market here is your specific community. The systemic differences are the institutionalized bias and discrimination that cause privilege to come about. And so people have privilege based on these institutionalized biases and systemic issues. And so you can use that privilege that results from the systemic differences to actually create a profit for your particular community. And the profit shows up in the form of your particular tech community's culture becoming more inclusive. And that tech community could be your local Python community, it could be your specific company, it could be your local meetup, it could be your open source project. And so that's the arbitrage angle. So again, a term that might not be familiar to people without a finance background. So again, privilege arbitrage, if performed consistently, leads to an inclusive culture. This is my underlying thesis. The consistent privilege arbitrage will lead to a more inclusive culture, or the realization that this culture can't or won't be changed. So either one of those is useful information, because there are some situations where you have a culture, whether it be in a company or in an open source project, where the people who control the culture in that situation have decided, you know, we're just not going to be more inclusive. It's not important to us. And so finding that out and knowing, okay, you know what, I might need to move on or create my own separate group or organization is important information. But privilege arbitrage will either change the culture or let you know that it can't be changed. But in either case, you can take the appropriate action. So again, we see the causal chain here, privilege awareness, which can help contribute to privilege arbitrage, which can lead to a more inclusive culture. And so we talked a lot about privilege. I've defined arbitrage. The question then is, where does privilege sort of come from? And I'm going to look at a few of the sort of underlying causes of privilege just to sort of clarify that and to make that clearer, because that helps to explain what actions you can take or that are needed to perform privilege arbitrage. So we look at the origins of privilege. I've got this, I try to make it sort of as Pythonic as possible, sort of a Jinja template here, where XYZ can be substituted for race or sex or what have you. So we've got these three different levels. And you've got this sort of bias. So I'll use sexism, for instance. So a sexist person is, you know, sexism or just being sexist is a person's individual view. So maybe a person thinks, you know what, I don't think women should be in the workplace. Well, that's a person who's sexist. Not a great thing, but that's just one person with this idea. Sexism is where a person actually is able to use their power to cause that thing to come into place. So I'm in a position where I'm hiring people, let's say software engineers. I'm not going to hire any women because I don't believe women should be in the workplace. That's sexism. Institutionalized sexism is when these sorts of things become either socially acceptable or they become, whether it's just socially acceptable in general, or they become encoded in laws or in normal practices. And so if there are laws that are passed that say, well, you know what, women can't be hired in certain fields, there you have institutionalized sexism. And that sort of institutionalized sexism then creates privilege for men. And so this is where these things come from. And it's important to look at it, I think, in these levels, because people sometimes think about privilege or different types of bias from the standpoint of, if someone isn't like pointing at a woman and saying, hey, woman, go make me a sandwich because I'm a man and you're a woman, if someone's not doing something as overt as that, they think there's no sexism happening. But the reality is the institutionalized sexism or racism are the problems, and they're so deeply embedded in a lot of our cultural norms that they're invisible. So, local example, we'll take a look at the Oregon Black Laws. You can go to this link and read a slightly more detailed discussion of it. The short version is that here in the state of Oregon, in 1857, there was a constitutional clause that was added that made it illegal for blacks to own real estate, to enter into contracts, or the right to sue in court. So basically, most of the legal protections that existed for people didn't exist for blacks, and the ability to actually sort of conduct commerce, because it's really difficult to run any sort of a business if you can't own property or sign a contract. And so at the time, and again, this is sort of a subtle but important point, at the time that might not have sounded so crazy because we're looking at 1857, we're running up to the Civil War, and the people who are running the Oregon Territory are trying to avoid, quote unquote, the race problem that's plaguing the rest of the country. So their solution is, well, if we just don't have any black people, there won't be a race problem. And so it might not seem that crazy in that particular context, but the reality is you have this clause that's in effect from 1857. It's in place in the Oregon Constitution until 1927, so 70 years later. But what that gives you is effectively 2 generations or more of people who grew up in an environment where it's just perfectly normal for black people to not be able to sign contracts or to own property or to have any sort of legal remedies in a court situation. And so this was repealed in 1927. That doesn't mean that in 1928 everything was wonderful for black people in Oregon. These things carry on. As a point of reference, my grandmother was born in 1922. And so someone relatively close to my age would have a grandparent who was raised by a parent and a grandparent who grew up in a situation where these conditions were the norm. And so those sort of values get passed on, but you have a tremendous amount of privilege that accrues to white people in this particular situation because of this institutionalized racism. But not just to pick on Oregon. It's not as if, poor Oregon was like the only place doing bad things. We look at the state of California and then the entire United States, the Chinese Exclusion Act. There was a fear that Chinese laborers were artificially depressing wages and providing too much competition in the workforce. Keep in mind, this is after literally boatloads of Chinese people were brought to the U.S. to build railroads. But now suddenly there's a problem because they're ruining everything. So this happens with race, and it's not just race and ethnicity. The idea of women's suffrage here, that women weren't allowed to vote in the United States until 1920. So what did that do to political power that women might have in the United States? So again, you have all this privilege that's accruing because of this sort of institutionalized racism or sexism that becomes part of the norm for everyday people. So when we start to look at privilege, again, people sometimes think that privilege is this sort of special benefit that they're getting. And since if they're thinking, well, I'm still having to work hard, I don't have privilege. I worked hard just like everybody else. Well, this is a quote from another AlterConf speaker from last year. Privilege is not wealth or having it easy. It's what you don't have to deal with. It's this whole set of problems that simply don't exist for you because you're in this particular group of people. It's not anything that you work for. It's just a benefit that you get. Certain problems just don't exist for you. Keep this in mind because this is the definition of privilege that I'll be using later when we start to look at personal privilege profiles. There's also the idea that privilege is a spectrum. It's not just a binary. Some people, when looking at privilege, will think that, oh, well, I either have privilege or I don't. It's not quite that simple. It's a spectrum. There's a range of privilege that's available. The quote comes from Noah Botanist, who actually was also a speaker at AlterConf. Both of these people spoke. I spoke at AlterConf in Austin in 2015. Both of these people spoke with me, and I'm glad that I was able to steal wisdom from those people. So that was nice. We take a look here at some people who have, if you've never had bad experiences with the police, your experiences are a product of racism and privilege, not virtue. So if you haven't had certain problems, it's not because you were just doing such a great job or because you're awesome. It's which a lot of people tend to think. It's because there are certain institutional biases that are in place that have benefited you from that. So this is one specific example, but we can switch out the race here with a lot of other things. So you have men who think, oh, well, sexism, that's, I don't really see much sexism. I don't think that's a problem anymore. That's like from like Mad Men. That's only on TV. Well, no, men, you don't see a lot of sexism because you're a man, and that's, we live in a patriarchal society. Or heterosexual people or cisgender people or gender binary people who are like, well, the gays have all these extra rights now. They can get married and everything, so everything is fine. Well, no, that's not actually the case. These are problems that don't affect you. So also, don't ever say the gays unless you're like Lady Gaga or someone like that. But otherwise, just remove that phrase from your vocabulary. So what's the point of all this? Is the point of all this that Kojo hates everything and he's just angry? No, that's not the case. The case here is that one, institutionalized bias is an actual real thing, and then two, that bias creates privilege across multiple axes. And so these are actual things. And so the trick with privilege is, again, especially institutionalized bias, again, privilege created by this institutionalized bias, the fact that it's institutionalized makes it invisible. And so it's difficult for people to see. It just becomes the norm. This is just how things are. It's not, it's not somebody like in a Ku Klux Klan outfit burning a cross on somebody's lawn, or somebody, telling, some guy telling a woman to make him a sandwich. It's kind of like the Matrix. It's this sort of invisible thing that's always around you and it's hard to see. Being aware of it and having more awareness of how privilege manifests itself is part of the challenge. And that's why I talked so much about privilege awareness earlier in this talk. So how do you make people more aware of privilege? This idea of trying to visualize privilege, this is something I've been working on, what I call the personal privilege profile. And so this is something that's designed to help people see what their privilege actually looks like in comparison to other people. So I've got 6 axes here that I'm using, and this is intended to be a starting point. There are a number of different axes upon which you could look at this sort of thing. I'm not an actual social scientist. I have a few friends who are, so I'm planning to pick their brains and see if they can help me refine this. But I've got 6 sort of basic starting axes. The first 4 that I call the external axes: gender identity, sexual orientation, maleness, and whiteness. And so the reality is that we live in a cis-heteronormative, patriarchal, white supremacist society. And I know that sounds terrible, but it's also it's actually the actual truth. And so the reality is the closer you are to any of these norms, the more privilege you have and the fewer problems that you have. And we'll get into my personal privilege profile in just a moment, and I'll sort of go into more detail about these things. I've labeled these axes. When we see the graph, I've labeled them with their maximum privilege state on my graph. I also call these external axes because these are the ones that are, 1, more easily observed by people outside and around you, but then 2, these are also the axes that are more difficult for you to actually do anything about individually. So, like, I'm male. Can't change that. If you're female, it's difficult to sort of make that change. Or if you're heterosexual or not heterosexual, it's really difficult to change that, despite what people at various religiously oriented camps might try to tell you. So these are more external things. The internal axes, the final 2 axes, are family, educational background, and family wealth. I call these internal because, 1, if you're interacting with people, it's difficult to tell, oh, well, what kind of family educational background did this person have, or what kind of wealth does their family have. But the reality is, if you come from a family that has higher education, it's much easier for you to get access to higher education, or to know that that's something that you can do, or to know how to do that. Like, if your parents went to college, they can probably better advise you on how to prepare well for college and how to get into a college than if your parents didn't go to college. So again, I'm using a 10-point scale. I've assigned 2.5 points for each college-educated ancestor, basically, parent or grandparent. And also family wealth. Here, I'm just sort of approximating the national median wealth percentile. So if you're about quote-unquote average wealth, then you would have a score of 5. So I think it's always important to start with introspection and to look at yourself first and to start from your own experiences and try to speak from your own experiences. So we're going to start with my privilege profile, or at least my interpretation of it. So here, let's look at that for a moment. So here's my interpretation of my personal privilege profile. I'm a cisgendered heterosexual male, so you can see I've got 10 points on those 3 axes. I'm not white. I've given myself a score of 1 on the whiteness scale because while I'm in fact not white, as far as skin shades go among African Americans, my skin is slightly lighter, and there are actual benefits. There's actual sort of positive feedback I get for that. And for people of color, especially people of African descent or of South Asian descent or even of East Asian descent, it's relatively common to deal with the fact that lighter skinned people are considered better just sort of in general. That's the state to move towards. So I've given myself a score of 1 on the whiteness scale. Wealth, I've put myself at a 4 here. I was raised by a single parent who was a high school teacher. So, you know, I didn't grow up poor by any means, but as we all know, teachers aren't the most well-paid people in the world. On the education axis, I give myself a score of 5. Both of my parents graduated from college. However, most of that score is based around my mother and my grandmother. My mother graduated from college, actually had a master's degree in education. My grandmother didn't even attend high school, but education was so important to her that it's this very strong value in my family. And so in the generation before me, my aunts and my uncles, the people who were raised by my grandmother, you were going to learn something. You're either going to learn what was in school, or you were going to learn about the back of my grandmother's hand. Or you were going to learn about whatever she could pick up and hit you with. But you were going to learn something one way or the other. So most of my aunts and uncles chose to learn about what was in school. And as a result, when it got to my generation, the idea of were we going to finish high school and try to do some sort of education beyond that, it was just a foregone conclusion. And so that's not anything that happened because I worked really hard for it to happen. That's just something, just sort of a benefit that I got from my family, from the work that the generations before me put in. So if we take a look at my personal privilege profile, where are my opportunities for privilege arbitrage? I will talk about these in a little more detail later, but we can see clearly that I am fairly privileged when it comes to being cisgendered, to being male, and to being heterosexual. There are all sorts of problems that people who aren't cisgendered, people who aren't male or who aren't heterosexual have to deal with that I don't. I never have anybody tell me that, you know what, Kojo, you just need to find a husband. You know, that's why you're causing so much trouble. I don't have any issues with people trying to figure out, quote unquote, what I am or things of that nature. If I'm dating someone, if I'm involved in a romantic relationship, I never have to think twice about what will people think if my partner is with me. All this crazy bathroom nonsense, all these bathroom bills, that sort of thing, like that doesn't impact me directly. And so those are problems that I don't have to deal with, that people who aren't cisgendered, people who aren't male, people who aren't heterosexual, they have to think about those things. Those are problems they have to deal with that I don't. And so that's where there are opportunities for me to arbitrage some of my privilege. So take a look at a few other privilege profiles just for the sake of comparative visualization. So here we're getting into some sort of fictional profiles. I've created composites of different people that I've known in different situations. And so I'm showing these mostly for comparative purposes. So here we have a person that we'll call Pete. Pete is a cisgendered heterosexual white male. So we can look at his privilege profile. I've kept the internal axes, family, wealth, and educational background. I've set those at 5 for the rest of these just for the sake of comparability. So we can look at Pete's privilege profile compared to mine. Clearly there's a big gap there. We take a look at Janice. Janice is the Pete's fictional sister. And so Janice has grew up in the same household as Pete, but there's again this large gap because Janet is not male. Janice is not male. Make up fictional people, it's hard to remember their names sometimes. John Paul. John Paul is a cisgendered gay man from New Orleans who is of Creole descent. So we see here he's cisgendered and male. On the white scale, I gave him a score of 2 because of his Creole background. For those of you who are not familiar with the Creole background, it's a mixture of people of African descent and French descent. Think of Beyonce. Beyonce is of a Creole background. So someone who is sort of lighter skinned, someone who looks black but is on the lighter end of the scale and is often considered to be more attractive than other people of African descent. So this is Jean Paul, but again, Jean Paul as a gay man has a score of 5 on the heterosexual scale. I assigned a score of 5 because while he's not heterosexual, gay rights have improved significantly, from where they were in the past. So there's a score of 5 there. That score could be lower. Again, this is sort of a starting point, just sort of to highlight the differences in privilege. So, and then here we have Sydney, who is also a Creole trans woman from New Orleans who dates men. And so here with Sydney, there are a few things to look at. One, being Creole, she has a white score of 2 like Jean Paul because she has a skin tone similar to Beyonce. A few things that are interesting to note here is that on this scale, I had to make her family wealth 6 instead of 5. Otherwise, it would have compressed the scale because 5 would have been her highest score. And I had to also make her heterosexuality and her male scores 0.5, Otherwise, the white score wouldn't even show up on the graph. There would just be like a line going out to 2. And so here, as a trans woman of color, you can see that the privilege profile is vastly reduced from that of a gay man of color, or a heterosexual white woman, or a heterosexual white man. And so all these gaps and spaces represent opportunities for privilege arbitrage. So how do you actually put this awareness to work? If you take a look at these and you've got some sort of better awareness of privilege arbitrage, of privilege, how do you actually put it to work? The first thing is to be an active ally for people who have different privilege profiles. And so I'll talk about sort of the types of things that I do. This is a simple thing to do. It is not a complicated thing to do in that respect, but it can be difficult. And so it takes more than just belief in equality. Certain action has to be taken. You have to actually do something with this. So in my case, I give presentations like this, and I try to think of ways to make tech cultures more inclusive. That's why I've given so many talks on this topic. I focus especially on making those cultures more inclusive for people who don't have the same privileges I do. So we saw my privilege profile before. I try to focus on making tech cultures more inclusive for women, because I'm male, for transgender people, because I'm cisgendered, and for people who aren't heterosexual, because I am. And so there's a set of problems that people who fall into any of those categories have that I don't have, and so I try to focus on those things. Also, people of color who are not African American. And I do that because, not because I just don't like my own people, but it's been my experience that it is much easier for someone to sort of dismiss a complaint if it comes from a member of that group. So if a woman talks about sexism, then it's easy to say, oh, well, she's just angry or bitter. If a man talks about sexism in a mixed group of men and women, it's easy for men to think, oh, well, he's just trying to show off. He's just trying to, get attention or whatever. But if a man talks about sexism in a group of only other men, then it's hard to dismiss that. And so that's one of the reasons I don't focus on issues that relate specifically to African Americans, because it's a little more credible that way. So what are some general guidelines on being an active ally? First, I'd say start with introspection. So take some time considering your own areas of privilege. What are some things that well, first of all, again, understanding your own privilege profile. Where do you have privilege? What are some things that, that you can do? What are problems that you don't have to face? Can't drink water. The next is to listen and learn. So once you've sort of looked at yourself and thought about your own privilege profile, it's important to listen to people who have different privilege profiles, because these people experience the world in a way that you can't and that you don't. And we're all intelligent people, but the reality is you can't just logic your way to someone else's life experiences. It's useful to actually listen to people. If you want to know, well, what issues do women face? Well, you should listen to some women. That might be a good place to start. So, what are the issues and concerns that people who have different privilege profiles from you have? I've met people who've run into situations, they said, well, you know what, Kojo, I don't know anybody who's not like me. Like, I know a number of African Americans who only know other African Americans, people who've never left their side of their part of town or what have you. So if you don't know any people who are markedly different from you in person, social media is an excellent way to sort of find some of these people, follow them on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or what have you, and listen to what they're saying. What are the issues that they have to deal with? What are their concerns? You'll start to see certain recurring patterns come up that come from these people's lives that you don't experience. It's amazing what you can learn by just listening to people. So listening and learning, very important, so that you'll know what issues are being faced. And then speak and act. So after you've introspected, after you've listened and learned, then you have to be willing to speak and act. You have to be willing to be a voice for people who have a different privilege profile, and as I pointed out again, it's especially important that you do this in situations where those people with those different privilege profiles aren't around, because that's when your voice is needed the most. And, and to take action on behalf of these people, again, especially when they're not around. I will tell you this from my own personal experience. Doing this is, one, not sexy. Like, nobody's like, it's just not glamorous or at all. And two, you won't get a cookie. There's no cookie for you. That's just, that's just how that goes. And so there are certain specific situations I'll mention that get brought up. I heard this early in my career with regard to an accounting firm where I was working. So I went to college in Texas, and I live in Texas now, and there was a person who graduated from an HBCU, a historically black college or university, and that person was fired from the accounting firm because they weren't performing very well. And that happens. The comment that was made was, well, she didn't do very well on the CPA exam. It's almost like she wasn't trying. I just don't know if that university's accounting program is very good. So one black person from this university didn't perform well, and so now the entire university's accounting program is questionable. So again, I live in Texas. The two big universities there are the University of Texas and Texas A&M. At least 4 or 5 people from each of those universities was fired at the same time. But somehow, no one thought that the University of Texas or Texas A&M had terrible accounting programs. And so in a situation like that, someone who wasn't of African American descent needed to sort of push back against that. And that's a general pattern. There's a lot of sort of conventional wisdom that's easy to go along with, easy to follow along with, but it needs to be questioned. And it needs to be questioned by people who have these different privilege profiles. So someone needs to push back against that sort of thing. One of the best ways to push back against that sort of thing is to ask the speaker, like, well, why do they think that? So in a case like this where someone's like, oh, well, I guess that accounting program is not very good. Well, why do you think that? Why do you think that, as opposed to looking at an accounting program where we've fired literally 5 times as many people? How is it that, how did you make that correlation? I've also run into situations where people will say things like, well, there aren't enough women or aren't enough people of color who in the tech pipeline, and the leaky pipeline fallacy is a whole other thing, or applying for these positions, blah, blah, blah. People will just say that because that's how they feel. We'll just question that. Well, why do you feel that way? Where did you get that information? And why do you think that's the case? And so, again, the pushing back needs to happen by people with different privilege profiles based on the situation. The next thing that you'll need to be able to do to be an active ally is to endure. So this is the Chinese character ren, which means to endure. It's an actual pictogram. The top half, it represents a blade. The bottom half represents a heart. Those of you who are familiar with ninja-related things might also notice this as the character for shinobi. And that's what that word actually means. Like to be a ninja is to be one who endures. And so if you're going to be someone who performs privilege arbitrage, you're going to have to be willing to endure. There's no quick fix to this. Again, when we look at systematic bias that creates privilege, it's something that's often created over a long period of time. The solution is going to take time as well. So you're going to have to be willing to endure as you go through this process. And the reality is, people will get mad at you. People are mad at me. I'm known at work as the angry voice of feminism. I'm trying to be a little less angry, but that's just how that goes. But my coworkers they know what they knew what they were getting. So that's how that goes. I would also say it's important to have faith. And so again, my thesis, I'll repeat it, is that consistent privilege arbitrage will lead to a more inclusive culture, or the realization that this culture can't or won't be changed. The key there is consistency. You can't just sort of show up, privilege arbitrage, and then it's all good. I wish that were the case, but if I think of something that you can just do once and fix everything, I'll be sure to let you know. But so far, all I have is this sort of consistently applied thing. But you need to have faith that this will work, but it needs to be applied consistently. It's like exercising, like eating well, like anything else. Even if the entire culture doesn't change quickly or immediately, it definitely provides a signal to other people in that culture that, hey, you know what? This is the kind of thing that we do here, and maybe I can try to do this sort of thing as well, so you can demonstrate it to other people. That might sound a little Pollyanna, like, ooh, everything be happy and rainbows. But this is actually my belief. I think that if you consistently try to apply something like this, it can help to change the culture going forward over time. So again, I'm Kojo Idrissa. My website is myname.com. I am reachable on Twitter as Transition. And if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to send them to me there. I think we might have a little bit of time for questions if anyone has them now. If anyone has note cards, they can, or people can raise their hands or what have you. Or if you don't have anything that you actually want to say to me now, and I can be reached on the Twitter. That's a thing. Thank you.